Okay. Well, I guess we'll jump in here. Thank you everybody for coming today. We've got a very special guest here. Her name is Jane Goodsill, and she's going to talk about her book I have here. It's called Voices of Hawaii. I'm going to hold it up to the camera. You guys can kind of see it. It's available at many public libraries here. We have plenty of copies available, and she's going to talk about the book and maybe some oral history perspectives on what she's done to put together the book. So I'm going to hand it over to Jane, and thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Justin. I
Thank you.
want to ask the people who've signed on, if you don't mind, joining in on the chat session and maybe say where you're signing in from and maybe age group so I can figure out how to orient my talk. Yeah, is that okay with you, Justin?
That's fine.
Okay. And then I want to say thank you to the Hilo Public Library for having this and sponsoring this event. I think it's fantastic. First of all, they got my book, which was wonderful. And then they asked me to come and be a speaker. So today my job is to talk about what's in my book, why I wrote my book. Oh, wait a second. People are responding. I love this.
Yes. Yeah, I see
Hang
some
on a
people
second.
in the chat.
Somebody's 25, Manoa. Somebody from Honolulu. Somebody from Kauai.
Kauai. Yep.
Hawaii, Manoa, 24. Oh, this is so great. Welcome all. Manoa. Are you guys getting credit for this? Because I know Manoa has a really good oral history department. Okay, so
All right.
what question should we start with, Justin?
Well, I've got a few to start. Jane, can you tell us about where you were born and about your kind of your family background?
Oh, sure. I was born in Honolulu in 1953, and that's when Hawaii was still a territory. And my dad had been a lawyer in Hawaii since 1941. He arrived in Honolulu 6 months before Pearl Harbor was bombed. And then he went away for the war, and then he came back and continued his career. So by the time he retired in 2004, he had been a practicing corporate attorney for 63 years. And did I know anything about what my father did? Not a thing. And I guess that's not such a surprise because who knows what our fathers do? And when we're children, do they talk to us, especially if they're corporate lawyers? Why would they tell us about what they do at work, right? They wouldn't,
Mhm.
they would assume we wouldn't be interested. But now that I'm a grown up, I'm very interested in what my father did, particularly because many of our fathers will actually, some of you, oh, here's somebody 70, that's almost my age. But the rest of you are 23, 24, 34. Oh, somebody teaches in Kaneohe. Thank you so much for letting me know and where you're coming from. That's wonderful for me. Um, but most people who are my age had parents who were doing something that affected the destiny of Hawaii. And so when we find out what it was, whether it was on a large scale or a small scale, whether it was just being a good citizen or whether it was doing something powerful and, in their career, it's valuable to find out what our parents did. So I started this whole project by finding out what my father did at work, by interviewing people who knew him. That was about 10 people. And then slowly but surely it began to spread, and people say, oh, why don't you talk to so-and-so? And why don't you talk to so-and-so? By the time I was through, I had interviewed 75 different people. And on the back of my book, you can see the names of all the people I interviewed. I can't hold it up there for forever, but they ranged in interest group from people who were high up in the power brokers to people who were farmers and teachers and ranchers, and the stories they told were so beautiful. I thought it would be a book. I didn't even know I was going to write a book, but I started out wanting to know about my father. And what I ended up knowing about was the things that had shaped the Aloha State during the generation that my father was living in, and then people that came before and people that came after. So this turns out to be a story that lives on for a very long time. I'm beginning to write book 2 now, and there doesn't seem to be any end in the number of stories I can collect. Does that answer your
That's
question,
great.
Justin?
Yes, it does. Thank you. That's great.
Thank you.
So, what kind of made you want to write a book like this?
Oh,
Is there?
well, I couldn't Once I collected the stories, let's say I interviewed you, Justin, and you're
Mhm.
a young person, but there's going to be something in your story there's going to be some moment when you're talking that in my brain, there's a little bell ding that goes off. And it's when you're telling me maybe how you got to Hawaii, maybe how you started your career, maybe what your passion is that led you to be in library science. Uh, who knows? Maybe it's the plot of land you live on or the people you know. I don't know what it is, but it's going to be one of those things. And I'll go, oh, that's a good story. And I'll ask you to delve into it more. And you will, because everybody does. And
Mhm.
then I'll say, my gosh, that's a beautiful story. We can't not tell that story. And so that was why I wrote the book, because I was in possession of 75 interviews, and within each one were a lot of stories. So I
Mhm.
picked the very best ones and tried to find a place to put them in the book.
That's great. And so it's kind of like a process of finding like most important like factoids about your people you interview, right?
Yes, but you use a good
Yep.
word because I am collecting a lot of facts about them, but the facts matter very little. For example, if you were to say, I got here on this date and then I did this and I was born and I went to, and then you name all your schools and you name all your activities, who cares? It's what happened as you were
Mhm.
going through that school. It was the experience that you had, maybe mingling and becoming one with the kids who were a different ethnicity than you were. That's a story. Or how you had some specific skills that brought you toward library science. Not everybody can do that. So
Mhm.
that's the story. So that's how it's not just the facts, it's the heart that goes behind what people are doing that makes a
I
really good
see.
story. Yeah.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Okay. Yes, it does. Yeah. That's because the whole book kind of every chapter kind of definitely shows that um, with the people you interview. Definitely.
Why
Um,
don't you ask me how I figured out the chapters?
well, the chapters, yeah, it's interesting how it's laid out. Um, it's not exactly chronological, right? It's a different kind of setup.
It's
It's
not
how did
chronological.
yes, not at all.
Well, it's a little bit chronological in a way that you wouldn't expect. For example, some of my chapters are called, first one is Voices of My Father's Generation. This was an
Yes.
homage to my father and his peers. Voices of the Old Days. This is an homage to the people who talked about plantation days, growing up when Hawaii was more Hawaiian, um, and so on. Voices of World War II. I talked to vets, I talked to prisoners of war. They told their stories. Voices in a Racial Melting Pot. Yipes. That was hard to
Mhm.
write because there are a lot of tender stories there. And it's a trick how to write a tender story uh, and keep the passion, not offend anybody, and just say the way it was. The good news
Right.
is, most people that I interviewed told me things that were completely transferable from their mouth to my book. And what I would do is if somebody told me a story about racial integration or racial segregation, I would write it up and do a little bit of editing so it reads easily. Then I would send it to them and I'd say, this is what I'd like to use. Are you okay with this? So every
Mhm.
person in the book has approved what they said, which means that I don't get in trouble later or haven't hurt somebody's feelings. And there are no
Yeah.
surprises. People know what's coming. And often I tell them the context I'm going to be using them in, because maybe I talked to somebody who talked about the same topic but had a different point of view. So I will say,
Mhm.
I'm going to say this that you said, and I'm going to say this that they said, because there's room at the table for all of our opinions. Now, so this is
Mhm.
not a book with any agenda. I'm not trying to push any one framework. I'm just telling stories.
Yes, it definitely shows that. Yeah, I like how the chapters are, topical like that, and it doesn't go straight chronologically. It's kind of interesting.
Well, because I would get people telling me stories of philanthropy. So I tried to gather all of those and put them in the chapter on Voices of Philanthropy.
Yep.
Same with natural resources. Same with the media and so on. So every chapter, there's 16 chapters. And then one of my most favorite was Voices of Inspiration. That's the last chapter. People just told me stories that didn't fit into any category except they inspired me. So
Mhm.
I figured that would be a fun way to end. A good way to begin would be with my daddy. Here's a picture of my dad. My dad was a serious guy. He was a real brainiac and he could solve all kinds of problems and blah, blah, blah. But this is him when he was having a very happy moment.
Wow, that's nice. That's nice.
There's
Yeah.
Marshall Goodsill laughing at a joke. And I love that picture of him. I think I have that picture. I put it in my book.
Yeah, I think
Yeah,
it is. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So that's how
So,
I organized my book.
okay. So Jane, what does the title mean to you, and how did you come up with the title? Was it something off the cuff, or how did you do it?
When you are taking oral histories, you are going out and you are listening to the voices of the people. And these people were from Hawaii. And so I thought, well, it wouldn't need to be called Voices of Hawaii. And somebody who I respect a lot came to a meeting, sort of pre-planning meeting in my book. And they said, I don't think I like the title. I said, really? Why? And this person said, because it doesn't represent all the voices of Hawaii.
Hmm.
And I said, you're right. You're right. No doubt about that. Not every voice of every spoken person in Hawaii or every story is captured. These are just the stories that I captured in this particular set of interviews. Then when I go on to the next book, which is going to be 50 interviews, there are 50 more voices that are talking. And then there may be another book. And as long as the stories keep generating, I may keep doing this if people are interested. And so far, people seem to be interested. They're liking this format and they're liking. Many people tell me, one person told me this. They said, I like to read just a little bit every night and then close the book. And I feel like I've just had my auntie telling me a bedtime story.
Hmm.
And
Very nice.
some people say, oh, the most honored review I ever got was from somebody my age who I'd known most of my life, who said, I have always de-emphasized my Hawaiian heritage. It was embarrassing to me to talk about it. And after reading your book, I now am ready to talk to my 1/4 and 1/8 children and grandchildren about my Hawaiian heritage using your book as a reference point. And it
Very
doesn't get
good.
better than that, that people
No.
feel inspired to tell their stories. Yeah,
Very good.
thank you.
So Jane, what is an oral history to you, and why is it fun, and why does it make you come back to do it again in a book format? Or
Well, I think I'll start that question by saying that I started my professional career as a licensed professional counselor, otherwise known as a therapist. So if you have some problem or another in your life, a situational crisis or depression or anxiety or trouble with somebody that you love or loss or whatever it is, you might come in to see somebody like me. My job then is to listen to your story, reflect back what I hear, and help you find a way to think about it so that it works in the real world for you. I can't change your life circumstances. If you were born rich, I can't change that. If you were born poor, I can't change that. If you are very amenable and a flexible person, I can't make you rigid. If you're rigid, I can possibly help you to become a little bit more flexible, but no guarantees. But people come in and do the amount of work they want to do. So my passion is, and my talent, I guess, is just listening to people. And so when I began taking oral histories about my father and the lawyers that I interviewed, who my father had hired or trained or worked with, started telling me about why they were passionate about the law. Now, that could be a boring story, right? Who thinks that a lawyer's job is going to be interesting? OMG, it was very interesting because of what they brought to it. And so, taking an oral history, the trick is to get the people to talk about the things that they have some passion about and helping them remember. And usually people, somebody told me, oh, it must be so sad because people must tell you really sad stories. Usually when you're talking to a person in therapy, they have a current problem happening right now. When you're doing an oral history interview, they've lived their whole life. If this was a trauma point early in their life, now they're here. They've generally found a way to think about it and they can reflect back with some wisdom upon it. So it's very rewarding and interesting occupation, taking oral histories. And if anybody in the crowd has any questions or want any more specific data on taking oral histories, put it in the chat box and we will address it.
Yes. So, can you tell us a favorite story about Hawaii Island or just Hawaii in general from your book? What's your favorite kind of anecdote or story that happened that you
I have
collected?
just come from Hawaii Island and I spent several weeks there. I spent 1 week in Honoka'a. I spent 1 week in Waimea, and I spent a weekend in Volcano just before all the bad weather. It was beautiful,
Yes.
glorious weather when I was there. I could hardly believe it could be so bad. But at each place, I just stayed and got a feel for the people. And that is such a varied island. Then I went and I did a reading in Kona, and I went and did a reading in Hilo. And from that, I just got a sense of welcome and aloha from the people on the Big Island, or as we're supposed to say, Hawaii Island. I may never be able to change that. But just the aloha that those people showed me. Justin, out of the blue, my executive assistant who's listening today wrote you a letter and asked if Jane Goodsill could do a talk for your library. And you said, well, you have to go through the library system and here's how to do it. You helped us do that. And then when I got approved, we set up a time and here we are talking. I mean, this is the kind of story that happens in Hawaii. It probably happens other places, but it fills me with aloha that it happens here in such a gracious way.
That's great. Thank you.
I also have a story I want to tell you about a man who's Hawaiian. This is in my book. And I'm not going to read the whole thing to you, but I'm going to tell you parts of it. This man tells me that he is 3/4 Hawaiian and 1/4 Chinese. And so, you know, the father was 3/4 Hawaiian, the mother is Chinese. And the father is a sugar boiler or sugar chemist, which is a really important job on the plantation. So he got sent to a plantation. He's from Hawaii Island, but he got sent to a plantation on Maui. So they're living there and everything is going really great, except that evidently the Haole Lunas don't know any ethnicity is different from another ethnicity. So the Hawaiian Chinese family gets put into the Japanese camp. And before you know it, they're all going to school together and they're all knowing each other and they're going to each other's houses and they're playing together and all the adults are auntie and uncle and all the children are cousins. And it's just a kumbaya feeling. He says, I had such a feeling of love growing up with all these people surrounding me. Next thing you know, I'm sent to boarding school on Oahu. And the first thing these people want to do is find out what my lineage is because I'm Hawaiian and I should be proud of that. And in the process of finding out my lineage, I find out that not one single one of those cousins, aunties, or uncles is related to me in any way, shape, or form. It never even occurred to me they were different ethnicities than I. But when I found out they weren't related to me, he said it was just crushing. It was just crushing. My world fell apart. And he is in a profession now where he helps people to bring their lives together. And I think that was a very sweet story about his upbringing.
Yes. Wow. And there's many stories like that in the book, actually. Yes.
There are many stories of that.
Yes.
Different. Yeah, there are
The
many.
human.
You've read it, Justin?
Yes. Oh yeah. Yep. The human dimension of everything comes through there very well. Of
Thank
course,
you.
because it's the people's actual, perspectives that makes it,
That's such a
brings that
compliment
perspective.
to the author when you say that the human dimension comes through,
It
because
does.
what would be the point of writing a book filled with beautiful human stories and the human dimension didn't come through? So thank
Right.
you so much.
No
I
problem.
can't tell
Thank
you
you.
how important that is to me that you said that.
Yeah, it definitely shows. Definitely. Let's see. Well, so I know the book will appeal definitely to historians and people interested in Hawaiian history. Is there anything in your book that might appeal to children or younger adults as well?
Well, I do have a couple stories in here about when we were children and the kinds of things that we would play with. This is in the Voices of Laughter. So hold on, give me a minute and let me pull that section up, and I'll just do a little teeny reading from my book. And
Okay.
if people who are listening have anything in specific that they would like me to talk about, please send it in. We have somebody monitoring the chats. So in
Yes,
case I
please.
miss it, she'll be able to
Just
remind us.
yes, people can type it in the chat.
Okay, so this is a friend of mine. She had a house in the country, and we would all go out there because it was a big house. And it, she said the house had 8 bedrooms, and every other bedroom shared a bathroom, which is an outdoor bathroom covered by plants. That was a big deal back in the day. The walls of the showers were bushes, and the showers watered the plants. There was a big row of royal palms that lined the driveway, and we would go up to them to the swimming pool. I mean, it was a really fun place. She said, Mrs. Shigioka made great, very thin pancakes for us every morning. Even in the late 60s, she or her daughter were still cooking on that stove. And it was a wood burning stove. And I remember she had to put the wood in, she had to get it up to the temperature. It's a real trick to do that. Many people don't know that. So the dining room was formal, and we never ate there that I remember, but we used to blow ping pong balls across the table as a game. The player piano was one of our favorite things with its rolls of music. We played musical chairs waiting for the roll to end. And I always lost that game. I hated that game. Filled me with so much anxiety. Then she says there was a macadamia nut grove on the property, and we used to try crack the nuts, roast them, and serve them to the grown-ups for poo-poo. We'd smash them with a brick, which would mash the shell into the nut, and we'd serve these awful things to our parents to eat. And she said there was some treachery in our play area. One wonders how we survived. We'd walk barefoot from the creek to the house over those round, pokey ironwood nuts. And there was this big old squeaky swing set, which we leapt off of and landed on the kiavi thorns. The cane fields were irrigated by flumes, which were filled with water. Many of you remember flumes, especially if you're on the outer islands. We would walk through the hot, dusty, red dirt cane fields to the flumes, where we would lie on our backs and let the water carry us away. That water was so cold because it came directly from the mountains. If the flume was full enough, you could slide along in the water and not rub the skin off your back. But if the water was too high, your nose broke all the spider webs. After rainfalls, we'd go mudsliding behind the house. It was a fun slide that would end up in a barbed wire fence. She said, I don't know why we thought all this was so much fun. So that kind of reminds me of the kids. And
Yes.
I don't know that this is specifically a book for children, but it
Maybe
is
not.
an
Yeah.
easy read that would make it, parents could read parts of it to children so they could learn about racial segregation and integration. They could learn about why there's not a power plant on the Hanalei River. And there's kind of
Exactly. Yeah.
that's a serious story, but there's a funny part in it where the developers from Utah said, yep, we're going to go up there and we're going to install this. And the people said, how are you going to do that? They said, we're going to sail our equipment. We're going to, what's the word? Drive on a river. We're going to transport it right up the river. Well, the river had many collapsed flumes and tunnels. There would be no way to get it up there. They obviously hadn't done their homework. Everybody in the room was quiet because they knew this was going to be the end of hydroelectric
Oh no.
on Hanalei River. So just pieces of history could be garnered if parents wanted to read parts to the children.
And get them future generations interested in what the past has to say too, as well.
Well said, Jason. That's right. Because there's something very precious about what our elders tell us. If I had been listening and my father had been telling me stories all along, I might not have had to write this book. It's a blessing to me that it worked out this way, but storytelling is a very important part, particularly of Hawaiian culture. So we need to keep it up.
Okay. Well, does anybody have any questions at this time, or let's see, open the Q&A here.
I'll look in my table of contents and see what else jumps out at me. Any funny
Yeah,
stories?
we can. There's just so many good ones.
There are so many good ones. It's hard to know. I did a radio show the other day for the Truckers Network, believe it or not. And it was Pearl Harbor Day. So I went through Voices of World War II, and there are many stories about what actually happened to people on the day that Pearl Harbor was bombed and what happened in their families. And I have maybe 7 or 8 different stories that really tell the in-person occasion. In fact, there's one of them that I'll read out loud because it's kind of funny.
Yes.
Okay, so this is by a man who was 8 years old at the time that Pearl Harbor was bombed, and he was in church at the moment. Hold on. I'm not finding it. Hold on. Anyway, I'll just tell you what I remember about it. He said, oh yeah, we were in Blessed Sacrament Church up in Newton. The statues were swaying when the bombs got dropped and falling over. This is an 8-year-old's perspective. We didn't know what it was. We used to go to the corner store and buy pastries on Sunday. And you remember December 7th was a Sunday. In there, the Clorox bottles were exploding. Bombs hit at Punch Bowl and Pacific Heights. 4 hours later, they took my father, and we didn't see him for about 4 months. The men were taken to be defense workers. He was putting up telephone poles that had been knocked down and similar repair work. We had no food because the ships weren't coming into Honolulu. The women were there for the family, and right away we started planting gardens and building bomb shelters. We always had chickens. My mom somehow got a cow and a pig, and we started raising animals. We had no school for about a year, he said gleefully. And when we did go back to school, we had to go in the morning and afternoon shifts. Oh, here's a question.
Oh, I see something
But there
came
are a
through.
couple questions. Do you want to ask them, or do
Okay,
you want me to read them?
sure. All right. We've got one from Tyler Sanford. What is one thing that you learned from your interviews that was the biggest surprise?
Tyler, I don't know if you told me earlier how old you are, but here's what I'm going to say. The thing that came to me as the most surprise is that grown men who are very accomplished in their careers and have done big smoke stuff, almost all became tearful when they told me about their fathers, when they told me about their mentors, when they told me about the people who had helped them get a leg up in the world. And it was so surprising to me that all these people who I looked up to as, movers and shakers were as sentimental as you can even imagine as they were looking back on their lives and their careers. So that's not a fact that I learned, but it was an emotion that I experienced that was very dear. Often you can tell I can easily be drawn to emotion too. And I would feel the emotion and we would be crying together. It was so sweet. It was so nice. Thanks. That's a good question.
And we have another, let's see. Okay, hi Jane. Are you currently interviewing people for a third, fourth, or any additional books? Our parents' generation stories are great, but stories from the current baby boomers might bridge some of those memories with things younger kids can't identify with.
All right. I hope it's okay that I use your name, the person who wrote this question, but Camille. I have pretty much specialized in the older generation because I figured they weren't going to be with us that much longer. So I started with them. I am now moving into the second book, and I'm not focusing on elders. I'm focusing on people who've become skilled artisans. For example, feather lei makers and feather cloak makers and kapa cloth makers and canoe makers and weavers and artisans of all kinds. I've talked to 3 different people who make ukuleles and guitars. And so this is more of the artisans coming to life. And a lot of it is Hawaiian art that is coming back into prominence because they're rediscovering through research what the Hawaiian artifacts were. So they're showing them by either recreating them or showing them in the paintings that they're doing. So but it's not as organized as you might think. Camille, I need your help. If we want to reach the current baby boomers, or if we want to reach the generation below, I'm going to need some help because I can't collect all these stories on my own. So let me know when you're ready. Start taking interviews. But interestingly enough, I am moving from the generation that was my father's generation, the men that were and women that were born in 1916 to 19 something. And so the next generation down is some of the baby boomers, and they have fascinating stories. Everybody does. Everybody has fascinating stories. Very few people I've talked to have just been a dud. I almost use information from almost everybody I talk to. Oh, and you're saying many of the traditional arts are undergoing revival. You said it, sister. That is really true. Yeah. So I think if you need to reach me, you could go to my webpage, which is voicesofhawaii.com, or you could send something to Justin at the Hilo Library and he could get it to me.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But you're going to need to help me, Camille, not just tell me names. You're going to have to start doing some interviews too. So do you think it would be of interest to people if I talked about how you do an oral history interview?
Yes, that'd be really good.
Okay.
If you have some pointers.
I do. The first thing that I do is I start out by saying, let's say I'm interviewing, hold on a minute.
Oh, there's something.
Yep. Oh, my master holly builder. I did interview a master holly builder, and he's going to be in the next book. He's a character. I love that man. I love almost everybody I interview. So here's how I start. Let's pretend I'm talking to that man. And I say, well, tell me how your people got to Hawaii. In his case, he's 100% Hawaiian. He's from Molokai. You might know who I'm talking about. And he says, on the first canoe, who knows how they got here? And then I ask him, tell me something about your lineage, the mother's side of the family, the father's side of the family. What were some of their names? How did they get into that occupation? What skills do you think they had? Or was it just luck, good luck or bad luck that led that? What do you remember about your grandfather? What do you remember about your mother? And I bring the ancestors in. First of all, that's what I do. And once we do that, we kind of have a sense of family going. And then I say, so what happened in your life? You're born, and what happens next, and what happens next? And then anything they say that is of interest, you say, tell me more about that. Let's say they're talking about building a hale, and I happen to have built a hale myself, which is not true, but let's pretend I know everything there is to know about building a Hawaiian house. But I say, yeah, I know all about that, so don't tell me about it. Well, what good does that do? Because then my readers don't get the treasures that could come out of this man's mouth. So instead, I pretend I know nothing, and I say, so tell me, how do you start? What are the things you think about? How do you do those cross beams, and how do you do the lashings, and how do you get the materials to do that, and what makes you want to do it in the first place, and how do you find apprentices? And I just keep asking any kind of question I can think of that has that I'm a curious person and I don't know much about how things work, and so I ask, and that turns out to be my very best technique. And I do have a couple of thoughts about how to get children engaged. So let's say you're a grandparent, and you want your grandchild to interview you, or your grandchild comes from school. My assignment, Tutu, is to interview you. And you go, well, and you're tempted to do what I said earlier, Justin. Remember how I said you give the dates, you give the places, and then boring. None of that matters, right? Well, it does matter. And this is how it matters. You say, I was born in 1940. And then you say to the kid, what do you think was happening in the world in 1940? And they go, I don't know. And then you have an opportunity to tell them that the entire world went to war. And you can get out a globe and you can show them all the countries that were involved. And you can show them how Hawaii was involved. So that's one way that you can sort of begin to teach them. And then what happened in your life during that war, so that they know a personal experience about what the whole wide world is at war. What happened to Tutu? Like she had to carry a gas mask for 4 years and never had to use it, but had to carry it every time. It puts our wearing masks to shame, right? Another idea is to say something like, ask me about my name. So the little kid will say, tell me your name, Tutu. And you tell her your first name. And then you say to the kid, ask me if I have a second name. She says, yes. So you tell your Hawaiian name that's this long or your Chinese name that's this long. And then tell me if I have ask me if I have a last name. Yes. Now ask me where those names come from. And then you draw on a little piece of paper for them. And you go like this. This is, that's my daddy. That's my mommy. That's me. My daddy's name was my mommy's name was and my name is And you can see I got his name from here, her name from there, and you can begin to teach them how names have importance in our genealogy and how they come down from generation to generation. Or if you get even more complex, you can go up a generation and say, I didn't get my name from my mommy or my daddy, but I got it from my great-grandfather, or further up. So it's just a way of teaching kids that our history is precious and that it lives on in them. So those
Exactly.
are just some ideas.
Oh,
So
another
here's
question.
Tyler is talking some more to us. I like it.
Oh, something. Let me see. Just move through here.
Oh my gosh. Well, you're going to
Got a
have to
few.
answer this one, Tyler. This is a hard question. What are some things that Generation Z and Millennials can learn from our Kupuna today and to modern Hawaii? I don't know. You tell me your ideas. I'm a story collector. All I know is what I collect and can give back to the people. That's the whole purpose for writing my book. Bernadette says, amazing, excited to read it. Thank you. It's as Justin says, it's at the Hilo Library and all the libraries in Hawaii. It's also available at all the bookstores. And also, don't tell anyone, but it's available at Amazon. But we prefer you get it from the local bookstores because we need, and the libraries, because we need to support local.
Yes.
Yeah. I'm kind of going back to that question. I probably should know an answer, something that Generation Z and Millennials. I guess maybe it goes back to what I said earlier, a sense of our history and a sense of why things happened. One of my father's first legal challenges when he got to Hawaii was to dismantle the railroad that went around Oahu. And in 1959 was the last time that railroad went. And I was just talking to a gal who works at the library who lives in Nanakuli, and that railroad went from downtown Honolulu through Nanakuli around Kaena Point and to I think it went as far as Kuhu, but it definitely went to Haleiwa. And the problem is, I don't know, Generation Z might need to know this. This railroad was very profitable during the war. It carried sugar, it carried personnel, it carried material, meaning material products, bags of sugar and whatnot, back and forth. And it made a lot of money. Well, if you make money during wartime, then what happens? You have to pay big taxes on it because it qualifies as war profiteering. You are not allowed to make a profit on material things during a war. Some lawyer could explain it better than I do. So the Dillingham Corporation who owned it had to make a decision. Are we going to pay this huge tax burden and go broke? Or are we going to dismantle the railroad? So my father, about, I don't know how old he was, 27 years old, 28 years old, had to figure out how to dismantle a railroad, which involves any railroad has to do with the federal government because they're in charge of all the railroads. So, and land acquisition and who owns this land and where does it go to afterwards and how do we get rid of all the parts? And he said it was extremely complex, but very interesting. So whether Gen X's need to know about that, I'm not sure, but I think anything that has to do with history is something they need to know.
Oh, another question.
Go ahead, Jason.
So as an author, how do you think technology, social media, etc., has benefited or negatively impacted the way stories are told in general, or the ones that you hear in Hawaii?
Wow, you guys are serious with these questions. Okay, how do I think technology has benefited or negatively impacted the way stories are told? Having started with the elders, I will tell you that their language skills are generally much better. Once they get started telling a story, they stay on task and go to the end of it, and then they stop talking. That thing about stopping talking is something a lot of the younger generation doesn't do. And they go over here, they go over there, they go over there, and then where was I? There's not as much discipline in oral recitation as there was in the old days. That's one thing I noticed. And I don't know if that has to do with social media or I don't really know what that has to do with. But as an oral historian, my job is to keep people on task. So if I'm talking to Justin, he gets waylaid and begins going way over here and way in depth in a subject that's not particularly pertinent to anything. I'll say, okay, let's go back here and tell me what, at this point, you were about to tell me something and you went there instead. Go here, tell me where we end up. And so my job is to help to keep people on task and to tell the very best story that they can. Yeah, but in general, the people who have told me their stories have told me wonderful stories. And to make it ready and digestible for the public, I do a lot of editing. And which is another reason why I share it with people after I've collected it, because I will change their words to make them more concise, more readable, more condensed. I want to give a pure little pearl of a story. I don't want a long rambling story. This is an interesting topic in the category of, oh, we have 2 minutes left and then we're going to get cut off. Some oral historians don't believe in editing anything. I believe in editing and getting the approval of the people that I've interviewed so that it is an exact replication that they are proud of. So Justin, is there anything we needed to do to wind up for
Oh,
today?
well, Jane, we've got one question came through just now on the Q&A. So, aloha, I'm an aspiring fiction writer. What do you believe is the best way to incorporate culture, namely Hawaiian, in writing?
Read it again. This person is an aspiring fiction writer.
Aspiring fiction writer. What do you believe is the best way to incorporate culture, namely Hawaiian, in their writing?
Talking to the people who are cultural practitioners. I don't necessarily mean you have to go to the top guy. You don't have to go to the head kahuna and get his story. You can talk to the people that are learning from him, the people that are uncovering Hawaiian techniques for weaving, for example, and talk to them. Talk to the people who are caring for the volcano on the Big Island. Talk to the people that are taking care of the botanical gardens on the outer islands. Talk to the people that are collecting material for the libraries. Talk to the people and find out what the real stories are, because the stories in this book, you can tell, are going to, for the most part, they're going to be true or have something that you could fictionalize from, and you wouldn't be too far off because these are the stories of real people. If you were just to get something that you read on in the newspaper, it might or might not be accurate reflection of the real feelings and tendencies that are happening in Hawaii nowadays. So my suggestion would be to talk to the real people in order to get ideas that you could then turn into your fiction, and then be very sure to say that this is my fictionalization of an idea that I got from somebody who really does make a cup of cloth, or who really does look at telescopes to look at the sky. I think that's my best answer for that.
Good, excellent. Does anybody, well, that about wraps up the formal part. Does anybody else have any more questions for Jane?
I know
Looking at the chat here.
I know when we hang up, I'm going to say, oh, I wish I'd said, but I don't know
Right.
what it is. I just appreciate everybody listening and tuning in. It's my honor uh, to have you here as I talk today.
Honored to have you as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Justin.
Thank you, guys.